This was an article in the People's Crier entitled Voiceless. It was written by an anonymous person living in Seattle. My partner is the most beautiful person I've ever known. I don't say that to speak on her physical attraction, though she's the kind of woman that Helen would have denounced the would-be suitors waging war under the impervious walls of Troy for. What I'm really speaking to is my partner's ability to view the world through the eyes of innocence. Childlike wonder lights up her smile when she sees a dog. Yes, any dog. As I write this, I'm watching her in the kitchen. Mismatched socks slide across the linoleum as she encourages our two dogs to dance, clapping and hopping to the rhythm of whatever song she hears in her beautiful head. She doesn't know anyone's watching her. This is just the kind of person she is. She's engaging them in conversation, and her laugh fills the room around her with the kind of warmth you only get from an especially loved grandmother to whom you're the favorite. Of course, so is everyone else. I have never met another person like her. One of the greatest lessons this epitome of a woman offered me early in our relationship was to give back to the world what you're not getting from it. She lives her entire life striving to be the light for those who don't have one. This was the desire to uplift and protect that led her to join the protests. Like many of us, she was unable to hear the call of George Floyd for his mama and turn a blind eye to the continued violence of the police state constructing its watchful walls all around us. This physically unimposing bastion of generosity put herself on the front lines nightly, raising her voice against the armed and armored foe hatefully scowling at us from beneath their off-kilter face masks and fingerprint-dirtied visors. I watched the gang, given authority to police and secure our citizens, violently shove her against street signs, deliberately spraying oleoresin, capsaicin, or OC into her face from less than a foot away, and laugh at her frustrated cries for justice. I witnessed an officer wearing the badge of the Seattle Police Department tackle her to the ground, stopping her from protecting the defenseless woman another police officer was violently raining blows upon. She was arrested that day for trying to stop an officer of the law, someone meant to protect and serve, from inflicting grievous harm on a stranger, someone she will probably never know. After her arrest, my partner was held for a double-digit amount of hours before they booked her into the jail and allowed her phone access. It would be more than a day before she was released, during which she was held in solitary confinement. Despite the detainment facility's stated policies of providing all detainees with clean, laundered masks every day with breakfast, my partner was refused fresh personal protective equipment, forced instead to wear the same dirtied mask she was given at the onset of her incarceration. The detainment center gave their detainees masks that were still stained with the makeup from the previous bearer, refusing to protect American citizens from the coronavirus pandemic that has shut our country down, despite our president's best efforts, for the last 6 months. Oh, I'm sorry. That just makes me so mad. Inside, the security guards ridiculed and humiliated the detained political prisoners. The system did its best to make those incredibly powerful humans forget the strength they'd been cultivating, trying to rip it from them along with their identity, and in its stead offer a substandard replacement identification. Fearful felon, possessed of enough self-preservation to stray from being caught in the streets again. That's what it's all about. Intimidation and control through the state of fear. I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to be secure in the knowledge that most of their authority has been given to them directly by us. I just want to point out really quickly that Black and Brown communities have been dealing with this for a very long time, and that this perspective is new to a lot of white people. Like I've known this since I was like 12 years old from personal experience, but to a lot of white folks, this is something that they're waking up to right now. So I just want to acknowledge that really quickly. The first days I joined in raising my voice, I was afraid. I didn't know what to expect, so it was easy for whatever expectations I had to be immediately subverted. I like to over-prepare, and I spent a lot of time talking to my partner about what our plans were. By the time we arrived, the crowd was already swollen. Angry chants rang out over the calls for bodies to the front. The atmosphere was charged from the beginning. 1,000 disconnected people stood, lifting their voices separately as one. We joined in the chanting. Say his name. I read the signs raised around me, letting the anxiety of being swallowed by a mass of sweating, upset humans wash over me. None of these people were familiar to me. The energy of the space was equally removed from my experience. We walked through the crowd, which started out far from the line, people milling about near Cal Anderson Park. Let us through. Let us through. Emotion rippled through the crowd, equal parts frustration, fear, and rage. They had stopped the crowd from marching, erecting barriers against the forward momentum of a movement driven by another extrajudicial homicide at the hands of the very people we were taught to respect. Take off your riot gear. We don't see no riot here. They were supposed to be protecting us. Seattle is no stranger to wanton violence in the hands of police. In what would become commonplace and expected in the months to follow, on June 1st, the police initiated the violence. After hours of bodies crammed against bodies, the group trained to deal with crowds of people began to lose morale and break. Uncoordinated, untrained officers began yanking at protesters' personal property, trying to steal away from them the methods of protection they had brought along. A pink umbrella started it all. As soon as the thieving officer started yanking on the umbrella, the police line lost all semblance of control. I remember watching that. I was watching it live on stream. It was a moment. Sorry, I lost my place really quick. Multiple officers deployed pepper spray indiscriminately, vainly working to corral the crowd, already agitated by the over-abuse of police force, with more force. As the Seattle Police Department asserted their privilege to utilize, in their words, less lethal munitions against the people arrayed against them, no one was safe. Protester, press, and passersby alike were caught in the ensuing chaos. The interesting thing about the show of force riot police employ in these situations is how ineffective they become against groups desensitized to their shock and awe strategy. They want to overwhelm your senses. This is going to get kind of rough for PTSD sufferers, so just trigger warning for this part in particular. In a series of chaotic events, it becomes very difficult to compose yourself appropriately if every one of your senses is being assaulted and overwhelmed. How can you think to prevent yourself from yanking off your goggles and rubbing your eyes when they start to burn? How can you be calm enough to avoid breathing in the caustic gas choking out the people around you when there are explosions happening at eye level and underfoot? How can you avoid the explosions and assist the people around you in retreating calmly instead of panicked and trampling those behind them when the police are riding into your midst, slamming their bike handles into your chest and face, and screaming, "Move back," by the way? How do you stay safe yourself and keep those around you safe while all of that is happening at once? How do you continue to feel strong, empowered, and autonomously valid in shouting down the injustices and insidious brutality of a people arraying themselves into battalions against anyone who would dare resist? On the 1st of June, the first concussion grenade exploded less than a minute after clouds of pepper spray were shot across the crowd. This sentence doesn't really do that feeling justice, and the ones following this won't either. If they bounce, you hear that first. Your eyes catch on the oddly colored orange sparks emitting from the top. It's actually a beautiful color. Then there's the first pop. This is accompanied by a blinding surge of light. If you're cognizant of what's going on, you can look away. Sometimes you can't. Then there's the second pop, the real explosion. It feels like an immense amount of pressure passing through you all at once, like some cosmic being has rearranged all your atoms at once and put several of them back wrong. It passes over and through and around you, and your ears feel as though they're going to burst from the pressure trying to escape you. I remember those first moments with pristine clarity. The way the crowd seemed to bulge all at once, then collapse in on itself. The angry shouts of people determined not to break under the assault mingling with the agonizing screams of unprotected people now drenched in OC. 4 explosions followed the first, and the screams turned to wails as a sinister yellow gas of smoke rose from the center of the scattered explosions. The low-hanging cloud crept along the street, filling the intersection, and in its wake, one thing was certain. Some of their blast balls were actually CS canisters. Shouts of "run" overrode more experienced voices. The crowd scattered, dispersing in any direction available in an effort to get away from the cacophony of experience raining down upon them and around them. As much discussion as we had beforehand, my partner and I were not prepared, and the OC bubbled and boiled along our skin. The clogging clouds of acrid gas, clung to our sweat-stained bodies, at once obscuring our vision and clenching at my esophagus, as surely as a fist around my throat. The intersection looked as desolate as any war zone. Sizzling orange sparks danced off thrown blast balls, at once dazzlingly beautiful and terrifyingly bright, in the dense choking hazard maliciously hanging over the intersection and the soccer fields beyond. My partner flushed the eyes of a victim of SPD with her last bottle of water, and we worked together to get them far enough up the intersection to escape the encroaching police force. Sickly yellow-green smoke hung over the entire neighborhood like a horrific fog, refusing to dissipate in the humid summer air. When we got home that night, there was a long time we couldn't really speak about what happened. The shock of the extent to which they'd employed their violence drove home the reasons we had gone out in the first place. I think we both cried in the shower that night. How can a system we've been taught to venerate be so unjust? How could we have allowed ourselves to be so misled? Good question. We took a hot shower that evening, trying desperately to wash away the violation of our safety to no avail. In the ensuing steam, we got to experience again the all-encompassing effects of chemical weapons still smeared and embedded in our pores. When I finally dressed and composed myself, I set out clothing for the following day. 2 shirts, 1 long sleeve, 2 pairs of pants, a pair of safety goggles, and gloves. I wanted to minimize how much of my body was exposed to the outside world to prevent myself from experiencing the panic the first day's attack had inspired. I wanted to help people see that they could stand up against the clenched fists of systemic compliance. The people gathered there had committed no crime beyond existing in a time and space that the city of Seattle had arbitrarily decided they felt uncomfortable about. For their non-crimes, Seattle indiscriminately deployed chemical and less lethal munitions against the protesters. Why? Scared people don't come back. Morale sits at the heart of every war, and tactics contained therein are cat and mouse attempts to break the enemy's morale and bolster your forces. SPD took an easy page from Machiavelli's The Prince. Quote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved because love is preserved by the link of obligation to which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage, but fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails." Unquote. Employing fear to erode the base morale of a group is how SPD maintains control and stops the coalescence of an active resistance to their brutality. Seattle makes a point of arresting those they feel have a say in organization and actively targeting people shining a light on their atrocities. Not even the press is safe from SPD's malicious bullying. As president of SPOG and de facto leader of the SPD, Mike Solon has created an atmosphere designed to dehumanize any worker who would dare lift their voice against the menace Seattle police have created in the streets of Seattle. His goons flock like winged monkeys set on a mission trip by the Wicked Witch himself, and their canisters of tear gas will paint the town emerald, or at least a sickly chartreuse. That's a yellowish color, by the way. Those first few nights felt like months. There was a stimulation on all fronts, and it was overwhelming. Standing in the crowd of folks gathered to protest the continued deaths of American citizens at the hands of our protectorate brought its own troubles. On June 7th, a man later identified as a relative of officers in the East Precinct drove his car through barricades erected to prevent vehicular passage against the gathered crowd of thousands. One brave man tried in vain to stop the moving vehicle. I heard the commotion from across the crowd, heard the screams, and saw the collapse of the right side of our line as the gunman fired at our defender. Later footage shows him walking calmly through the crowd and right up to the police lines. Shortly afterwards, Seattle police would use the justification of thrown water bottles in conjunction with having seen the man in custody's gun to indiscriminately gas and bomb the Capitol Hill neighborhood for hours after that. It's difficult to explain the exact nature of what a day on the front lines of these protests feels like. In addition to the charged atmosphere and general potential for chaos, you're also often contending with multiple sources of information vying for your attention. You will at once be assailed with calls to hold the line, to split off and march elsewhere, and disperse and go home for the evening. By the way, never, ever, ever let anybody split the crowd. You understand me? Never, ever let anyone split the crowd. Fuck you, Boots. In addition to the lack of information and conflicting calls for the best course of action, police scanners delivered deliberately misleading information to the supports listening in to communications and offering live updates. Paranoia fueled by this kind of information can have a devastating impact on your own psyche, and it's important to be vigilant and skeptical, but open to what you're seeing and hearing. One of the most confusing things to happen in those early days was the complete withdrawal from and abandonment of the East Precinct. To this day, rumors are still the best source of information about who made that decision and why it was made. The hollow victory provided by the SPD's withdrawal from the flashpoint that was the East Precinct defanged much of the active protesting community in the area. While in the days afterward, would-be warlords walked through the streets of the then Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which would become the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. Actually, it's not occupied protest, it's organized protest because we live on occupied land, but anyway. It felt yards safer than mere days prior to when the threats of chemical and incendiary munitions overcast any chance at maintaining a sunny disposition. Food tents were erected, a projector set up in the intersection, and documentaries played through the evening, while the martial law band played in the distance. How do you stay sane in the face of such an onslaught of stimulation, misinformation, and education? The single most important thing I've been able to do for myself and others in the moment and out of it is to remain grounded. Being able to take a deep breath and take in things around me that I can see, smell, taste, hear, and touch makes you more conscious of what is happening around you. The situation gains clarity, and where you might before have been feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or exposed, you can gain a fresh understanding of what is and what is not real. What is not a real pressing threat. So, that's a technique called grounding. Lots of therapists will, extol the benefits of that technique to their clients. So, highly recommend doing that if you're feeling overwhelmed. The physical pains of being present at these protests takes its own toll. Bruising from less lethal impact munitions improperly aimed at protesters rather than the force ricochet dictated by a policy takes a long time to heal. I am still personally healing from being hit with a tear gas canister on the inside of my knee, which prevented me from walking for 3 weeks, by the way. Burn scores from concussion grenades exploding too close to your flesh will take longer. You may never recover from the hearing loss caused by their weaponized crowd control agents. The longer these protests are sustained, the more emotional the trained police force gets. I have watched malicious glee play out in laughing police faces as they brutalize lines of people decrying generational abuse and bigotry at the hands of trained individuals contractually obligated to police their city. I've watched the police mock protesters and heard them call us cockroaches. I've seen the Seattle Police Department show wanton cruelty and willful disregard for the humanity of people who would dare stand up and tell them to quit your job. The more personally these officers feel, the less likely they are to rely on their meager amount of training when their reactionary leaders respond to direct action against the continued tightening of what Mike Solon would like to believe is an iron fist. It's not. Fuck you, Mike Solon. The vast majority of protesters who have been arrested have been released from their bonds, but with charges hanging over their heads in the case that the Seattle prosecutors ever decide they want to impose further restrictions on their freedoms to demonstrate and utilize their voice in our democracy. The ever-present threat of felony charges hanging over many heads puts that fear into their heads and keeps it there. In many states, felons cannot vote, further reducing the voice of people who have only set out to have their voices heard to begin with. The war for our rights is waged on a multitude of battlefields, and our enemies know the lay of the land better than many of us ever could. It is our perseverance and our courage in the face of intimidation, and our solidarity in the communities we have fostered and fostering through continued organization and action, and will foster in the coming months, that lets us stand united forever in the face of an authoritarian hydra, unflinching. No matter what you are told, you are not alone. You are not helpless. We will never be voiceless. And so that's the end of the article. It's only a snapshot in time, and it's from one person's perspective. But there are so many of us that have similar experiences, and there are so many of us who have had generational trauma that has been so much like that here. So I've been hearing from a lot of people just out and about doing my errands and what have you, that they don't even realize that there are still protests going on. And that's something that we need to change. We need everybody that can be out in the streets to be back out in the streets, because we need to protect the people who are standing up and using their voices to speak out against this invasion of police in our society. We have to defund them. We have to get to total abolition, and if people go back to sleep, that's not going to happen. So I would like very much for everyone who can go out to be out there. We need to go back to what it was like in June. We need to put the pressure back on them. We can't let up. Thanks.